The echoing sound of harsh insults completely shattered the elegance of the luxury glamping resort in Montana. I am Reagan, a single mother at the age of 27 who lost her husband in a tragic accident. My sister Zelda stood in the center of the grand hall wearing her pristine wedding dress while screaming at the top of her lungs. She pointed a furious finger at my daughter Tessa, who is 7 years old, ordering the security guards to kick her out immediately. "Get out of here, you fatherless brat!" she shrieked without a single ounce of hesitation or remorse. My mom alongside my father-dad stood right next to her with their arms crossed in absolute indifference. Instead of defending their own granddaughter, they simply watched the cruel scene unfold before delivering their own judgment. "Next time, don't bring her to family parties. She ruins your sister's big day," Mom declared coldly. I did not shed a single tear or waste my breath arguing with people who clearly despised us. I silently gripped the tiny hand of Tessa tightly to comfort her, before turning my back on them to walk straight toward the resort parking lot. The moment I sat in the driver's seat of my car, I pulled out my phone with absolute clarity in my mind. I calmly typed a text message containing exactly 6 words directly to my personal bank asset management system to trigger an immediate financial freeze. Do you want to know exactly what happened 30 minutes after I sent that decisive message? If you are curious about how they paid for their cruelty, please subscribe to the channel and follow this story to the very end, because their real nightmare has just begun. Half an hour after leaving the wedding hall, I drove through the pitch-black highway with a sleeping Tessa in the back seat. The rhythmic hum of the tires on the asphalt was the only sound in the car, providing a stark contrast to the chaotic insults that had just occurred back at the resort. I stared at the road ahead while my mind raced back to the structural foundation of my current financial independence. When my husband passed away in a tragic traffic accident years ago, he left behind a significant life insurance policy that was specifically designed to secure our future. I was designated as the sole beneficiary and the legal trustee of a substantial trust fund intended to provide for the long-term needs of our child. My memories drifted back to a painful afternoon, just 3 days after his funeral, when the grief was still suffocating, and my judgment remained clouded by sorrow. Mom and Dad sat me down in my living room, speaking in hushed, comforting tones that I now realize were carefully calculated to exploit my vulnerability. They convinced me that I was too emotionally unstable to manage such a vast sum of money alone while raising a young child without a partner. Under the guise of parental protection, they persuaded me to sign legal documents granting them secondary access to the trust accounts so they could assist with daily expenses. At the time, I believed their intentions were pure because I desperately needed a support system to help me navigate the darkest period of my life. The silence of the car was suddenly interrupted by the bright glow of my phone screen on the dashboard as it vibrated with relentless intensity. I did not need to pick up the device to know that the calm atmosphere of the wedding had been replaced by absolute panic. A series of frantic text messages from Gail began to flood the screen, her words escalating from confusion to outright hostility within minutes. She demanded to know why her secondary access to the primary fund had been revoked without any prior warning or discussion. The messages revealed that Zelda had attempted to swipe a linked credit card to finalize a massive payment for the resort catering services during the reception. The public rejection of that card in front of her high society guests must have been a devastating blow to her carefully crafted image of wealth. I watched the notifications pile up while feeling a cold sense of justice finally replacing the lingering hurt from their earlier insults. My phone buzzed again with a notification from the bank mobile application confirming that my recent command had been successfully processed by the system. The automated email stated clearly that all third-party access rights had been permanently terminated to ensure the security of the trust assets moving forward. This meant that every cent of the insurance money was now under my exclusive control, leaving the rest of the family financially stranded in the middle of Montana. I felt a strange sense of clarity as I realized that my parents had been treating my late husband's legacy as their personal ATM for far too long. They had grown comfortable using the money that was meant for the education of Tessa to fund the extravagant whims of Zelda. For years, I had ignored the subtle discrepancies in the monthly statements because I wanted to believe that my family still had my best interests at heart. However, their behavior at the wedding proved that they viewed me and my child as nothing more than obstacles to their desired social standing. By freezing those accounts, I was not just taking back money, I was reclaiming the power that they had stolen from me during my weakest moment. The relentless ringing of the phone finally stopped as Gail realized that I had no intention of answering her desperate calls in the middle of the night. I knew that they would be stranded at the resort with a mountain of unpaid bills and a shattered reputation among their wealthy peers. The thought of them having to explain their lack of funds to the hotel management provided a grim satisfaction that I had never experienced before. I glanced at the rearview mirror to see the peaceful face of my daughter, knowing that I had successfully secured her future against the greed of her own relatives. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in years, I felt like I was the one holding the steering wheel of my own destiny. At 11 o'clock that night, the sharp beams of headlights from the car belonging to my best friend Carmen swept across my living room window. I watched from behind the curtain as she carefully helped my grandmother Blanche step out of the vehicle and walk toward my front porch. Carmen gave me a firm embrace to offer her silent support before she immediately drove away to give us the necessary privacy for our conversation. My heart pounded against my ribs as I led Blanche into the kitchen, where the harsh overhead light revealed the tired lines on her face. She reached into her leather handbag to pull out a stack of crumpled tax statements and official bank notifications that had been sent to her old house by mistake. I received these tax notifications last week. The mailing address was incorrect, but the name of the person withdrawing the funds was definitely Raymond, she whispered while sliding the papers across the wooden table. The documents clearly indicated that significant amounts of money were flowing out of the trust fund in a pattern that was completely inconsistent with our agreed expenses. I felt a cold wave of realization wash over me as I looked at the signatures and the dates that matched the recent extravagant wedding preparations. Following the clues provided by Blanche, I opened my personal laptop to begin a deep search through the digital archives of my financial accounts. I decided to check the trash folder in my old email accounts, where I discovered a hidden filter that had been recently established without my knowledge. Mom had secretly configured the system to redirect all large transaction alerts and balance notifications directly into the junk folder to keep me in the dark about their activities. They hid this from me, redirecting every transaction notification to the trash so I could not see where the money was actually going. I told Blanche with a voice that remained surprisingly steady. We spent the next several hours meticulously comparing each physical statement against the hidden transaction history that I managed to recover from the server. Every line of data told a disgusting story of betrayal as we uncovered how the life insurance money meant for Tessa was being systematically drained. The funds were being used to pay for designer bridal gowns, expensive catering deposits, and even a luxury honeymoon suite at the glamping resort. It was painful to see the exact moments when Gail and Raymond chose to prioritize the vanity of Zelda over the future security of their own granddaughter. Despite the overwhelming evidence of their greed, I refused to lose my composure or let my emotions cloud my judgment during this critical investigation. I sat at my desk for the remainder of the night to print out every single proof of their unauthorized access and fraudulent transfers. The steady hum of the printer was the only sound in the room as I watched the stack of incriminating evidence grow taller with each passing minute. I carefully organized the documents by date and category before securing them inside a thick folder that would serve as my primary weapon in court. Blanche watched me with a mixture of sadness and pride while I finished the task of preparing for the legal battle that lay ahead. I knew that the next morning would change the family dynamic forever, but I felt a profound sense of relief that the truth was finally out in the open. The betrayal was deep and calculated, yet I was no longer the vulnerable widow they had manipulated 3 years ago in my living room. I looked at the thick folder on the table and felt a renewed sense of purpose, because I was finally fighting back for the sake of my daughter. By the time the first light of dawn appeared on the horizon, I had a complete record of every cent they had stolen from the legacy of my late husband. I thanked Blanche for her bravery in bringing me the documents because her intervention had given me the leverage I needed to end their exploitation. We sat in silence for a few moments, sipping cold coffee, while the reality of the situation settled around us like a heavy blanket. I was ready to face the legal consequences and the inevitable confrontation that would follow, because my priority remained the safety of Tessa. Tomorrow morning, I would present this evidence to my lawyer and ensure that Zelda and my parents finally understood the true cost of their cruelty. On the following Monday morning, I carried the thick folder of incriminating evidence directly to the office of my lawyer, Pierce. The atmosphere inside the professional suite was quiet, which allowed me to focus entirely on the upcoming battle for my daughter's future. Pierce examined the various bank statements and redirected email logs with a level of meticulous care that gave me great confidence. He noted the recurring patterns of unauthorized transfers that had been occurring for nearly 3 years without my knowledge or consent. There are very clear signs of financial manipulation in the way they used their secondary access, but we need to verify more original records from the bank to create ironclad evidence for the court, Pierce stated while looking over a particularly suspicious transfer. He immediately began the process of filing a formal motion with the court to permanently suspend all secondary access rights belonging to Dad and Mom. This legal action was designed to freeze the accounts completely while we conducted a comprehensive review of the entire transaction history since the trust was established. Pierce also requested a forensic audit of every wire transfer to identify exactly where the missing insurance money had been spent. My lawyer explained that this step was necessary to prove that the funds were used for personal gain rather than the welfare of Tessa as originally intended. While the legal machinery began to turn in the city, a different kind of tension was brewing at the home of Zelda. Her new husband, Justin, had started to become suspicious after the embarrassing rejection of the credit cards during their wedding reception in Montana. He discovered a mountain of unpaid bills for the floral arrangements and the catering services that were supposed to be settled weeks ago. When he checked their joint savings account to resolve the debt, he was shocked to find that the balance was completely exhausted. The harsh reality began to surface that Zelda had not only been stealing from my child, but had also systematically lied to him about her personal wealth. Justin confronted her in their living room, his voice echoing with a mixture of betrayal and confusion, as he demanded an honest explanation for the missing funds. "Where did you get the money to pay for this wedding, considering our joint account is now completely empty?" he asked while holding up the final notice from the resort. Zelda struggled to maintain her composure, yet her shifting eyes and desperate excuses only confirmed his growing fears about her true character. It became clear that she had pushed him into a marriage built on a foundation of massive debt and fraudulent promises. Back in the law office, I listened to the strategic advice of Pierce regarding the potential reactions from my family once they realized they were cut off. He suggested that we should prepare a petition for a restraining order to ensure the safety of Tessa in case Gail or Raymond decided to retaliate. The financial pressure would likely drive them toward desperate actions as they realized their primary source of luxury was gone forever. I agreed with his recommendation without hesitation because I knew from experience that my parents would stop at nothing to regain control of the money. The strategy was simple but effective, as we aimed to trap them within the very legal system they had tried to circumvent for years. Pierce prepared the necessary affidavits and served the bank with a formal notice to preserve all digital evidence related to the secondary access logs. We were no longer just reacting to their insults, we were systematically dismantling the network of lies they had woven around my late husband's legacy. I felt a profound sense of empowerment as I signed the legal documents that would finally hold them accountable for their greed. By the end of the meeting, the groundwork for a massive legal confrontation had been firmly established by my legal team. I left the office with a clear plan of action, knowing that the truth would eventually be revealed in a court of law. The road ahead would certainly be difficult, but I was prepared to do whatever was necessary to protect the interests of my daughter. I drove home in silence, feeling the weight of the thick folder being replaced by the strength of a solid legal strategy. The time for being a passive victim had ended, and the time for justice had officially begun. Exactly 2 days after my meeting with Pierce, I pushed open the heavy wooden door to enter the living room of the house where I had grown up. The familiar scent of old wood and lavender usually brought back warm childhood memories, but today it only served as a backdrop for a bitter family betrayal. Zelda Mom and Dad were already waiting for me on the large fabric sofa, their faces etched with a combination of lingering anger and desperate entitlement. My arrival was immediately met with a barrage of loud demands as they used their parental authority to pressure me into restoring their financial privileges. They claimed that I was destroying the family reputation by refusing to finalize the massive payments for the resort and the various wedding vendors in Montana. Restore the secondary access to the bank account immediately, because you are making this entire family go bankrupt just for a moment of stupid impulsiveness. Zelda screamed while standing up to tower over me. I did not respond to her shrieks with my own shouting, nor did I offer any verbal explanation for my actions during the first few minutes of the confrontation. Instead, I walked slowly toward the glass coffee table in the center of the room and calmly threw down the thick folder of incriminating documents. The sound of the heavy paper hitting the glass surface seemed to echo through the sudden silence of the room as they all stared at the evidence I had gathered. I watched their expressions shift from arrogance to confusion when they realized that I had discovered the exact extent of their systematic theft over the last 3 years. The folder contained every bank statement and the redirected email logs that Blanche had helped me recover during our late-night investigation. Zelda panicked almost instantly when she saw the specific transaction amounts for her designer dresses and the luxury honeymoon suite listed in black and white. She lunged forward with a desperate look in her eyes, attempting to grab the stack of documents so she could rip them apart before I could speak. In her hurried and clumsy movement, her hand struck a tray of glass cups and the heavy tea kettle that was sitting on the corner of the table. The glass shattered into 1,000 pieces against the hard floor, creating a sharp crashing sound that added to the chaotic tension of the moment. Mom gasped in shock as the spilled liquid began to soak into the expensive rug, yet Zelda ignored the mess while still trying to reach for my evidence. Dad remained seated but reached down to pick up a single bank statement that had fallen near his feet during the struggle. His eyes became fixed on the enormous total amount of money that had been drained from the trust fund without any legal authorization. The room fell into a suffocating silence as he slowly turned the pages, his face turning pale while he realized the full severity of the legal situation they were facing. He looked up at me with a stunned expression, seemingly unable to find the words to justify the betrayal that had been occurring under his own roof. "Look closely at the numbers on those papers, because that is the life insurance money of my husband, and every one of you will be held responsible before the law," I stated with a voice that was cold and unwavering. The realization that I was prepared to involve the authorities seemed to drain the remaining defiance from the faces of my parents. Gail began to stammer a half-hearted excuse about wanting to help Zelda start her new life, but her words felt hollow and meaningless in the face of the documented fraud. I did not wait for them to finish their apologies or listen to any more of their manipulative lies about family loyalty and sacrifice. My priority was no longer maintaining a relationship with people who had spent years treating the legacy of my late husband like a personal ATM. I leaned over and calmly gathered the original documents back into the folder while they watched me with a mixture of fear and growing realization. I made it very clear that this was no longer a private family dispute that could be settled with a simple apology or a promise to pay the money back. Zelda remained on the floor, surrounded by the shards of broken glass, her pristine image of a wealthy bride now completely shattered by her own greed. I turned my back on them and walked toward the door without looking back a single time to see their reactions to my departure. As I reached the threshold, I left them with one final warning that the official authorities would receive a full copy of the entire folder by early tomorrow morning. The sound of the front door closing behind me felt like the final click of a lock, sealing off a chapter of my life that had been defined by their manipulation. I stepped out into the cool air and took a deep breath, feeling a profound sense of relief that the most difficult part of the confrontation was over. The legal battle would continue, but I had finally faced my enemies in the very place where they had once held all the power over me. Late the following afternoon, a formal notice from the Financial Audit Agency officially announced a widespread investigation into the entire cash flow belonging to Mom and Dad. The swift arrival of this urgent news sent a wave of absolute panic through the household, as they finally realized that their actions had triggered a federal response. Gail and Raymond spent several frantic hours attempting to log into their remaining secondary bank accounts to transfer whatever funds were left. Every single attempt was met with a cold error message on the screen because the court had already acted to freeze the entire system. They realized too late that my legal team had moved much faster than they ever anticipated to secure the remaining trust assets. Every account is reporting an access error, and we cannot move a single dollar out to even hire a private lawyer for our defense. Mom screamed while throwing her phone against the sofa in frustration. Zelda was equally desperate, attempting to log into the Department of Motor Vehicles portal to transfer the ownership of her luxury sports car to a close friend. She hoped that by moving the asset out of her name, she could prevent it from being seized by the court to settle the mounting debts from the wedding. However, the online transaction was immediately rejected by the system because the vehicle had already been flagged as a disputed asset under active investigation. The domestic tension escalated even further when Justin reached his absolute breaking point after witnessing the sheer scale of the financial deception. He began packing his suitcases with aggressive speed, throwing his clothes into the luggage while Zelda stood in the doorway pleading for his forgiveness. Justin refused to listen to any more of her excuses because he did not want his own professional reputation to be tarnished by her criminal activities. "I cannot endure any more of these lies, and this marriage is officially over from this very second," he declared, before dragging his bags toward the front door without looking back. The departure of her husband seemed to strip away the last of Zelda's composure, leading to a vicious shouting match between her and my parents. Dad began to raise his voice at Mom, blaming her entirely for initiating the reckless plan to drain the insurance money for the sake of a wedding. He claimed that he had only followed her lead because she assured him that I was too weak to ever notice the missing funds. Gail shouted back with equal ferocity, accusing him of being a coward who was perfectly happy to spend the money as long as the accounts remained open. The family that had once stood united against me was now systematically tearing itself apart in a desperate attempt to avoid legal responsibility. While they were busy attacking each other, I received a phone call from Pierce to provide a critical update on the progress of the official investigation. My lawyer informed me that every effort they had made to delete digital footprints or destroy physical evidence had failed miserably. The investigators had already secured the entire history of the IP addresses used to access the trust accounts from the home computer of Raymond. They also possessed the original forged documents where Gail had painstakingly imitated my signature to authorize the illegal wire transfers. Pierce sounded confident as he explained that the electronic trail left by their greed was far too extensive for any defense attorney to effectively challenge. I sat in my quiet kitchen while listening to the report, feeling a strange sense of detachment from the chaos I had unleashed upon their lives. For years, they had operated under the assumption that I would always prioritize family peace over my own financial security. They never imagined that the quiet widow they had manipulated would eventually become the person to bring their house of cards crashing down. I looked at a photograph of my husband and felt a quiet sense of duty fulfilled, because his legacy was finally being protected from those who wished to exploit it. The walls were finally falling, and there was no one left for them to blame but themselves for the ruins of their own making. By the end of the day, the reality of their situation had become an undeniable weight that silenced the earlier shouting matches in the living room. They were trapped in a house they could no longer afford, facing a legal system that had no interest in their tales of family loyalty. The pride that had fueled their insults at the glamping resort in Montana was now completely replaced by a cold, looming fear of the future. I knew that the process was far from over, but the most significant blow to their perceived power had been successfully delivered. I ended the call with Pierce and took a moment to appreciate the silence, knowing that my daughter would never have to fear their manipulation ever again. 3 months passed since the initial confrontation at the resort, and the legal investigation had intensified into a brutal process involving a relentless series of federal court summons. Dad and Mom spent nearly every waking hour desperately scouring the city for a defense attorney who was willing to take on their complicated case. Every reputable law firm they approached immediately turned them away after reviewing the overwhelming mountain of digital evidence provided by the bank. The lawyers explained that the forensic trail of forged signatures and unauthorized wire transfers left no room for a successful defense in a court of law. Every lawyer just shakes their head and rejects us because they say the evidence is too clear, and this case has no chance of winning. Dad groaned during one of his rare frantic attempts to contact me. Zelda suffered her own devastating blow when she was officially terminated from her high-ranking corporate position following a formal inquiry by the federal investigators. The agency had sent a mandatory request to her employer to coordinate a review of her salary statements and internal financial records to trace the stolen trust money. Her professional reputation was completely destroyed within the industry, leaving her with no hope of finding another job in her specialized field of work. Realizing that they could no longer manipulate the legal system to their advantage, Mom decided to send a 3-page handwritten letter directly to my mailbox. The pages were filled with desperate stories about the sacrifices she made during my childhood, while she begged me to show mercy in the name of family blood. She used every emotional tactic in her arsenal to convince me that the financial theft was merely a series of misunderstandings rather than a calculated crime. I sat at my kitchen table and read the letter with a sense of detachment, feeling no connection to the woman who had helped steal the future of my daughter. I beg you for mercy just this once. Please do not send your own biological parents to prison over a few bank statements. Gail sobbed into a recording left on my home landline. Attached to the emotional letter was this frantic voicemail, where her voice trembled with a terrifying level of desperation that I had never heard before. She pleaded with me to contact the federal prosecutor to request a dismissal of the charges, or, at least, a significant reduction in their potential sentences. The recording went on for several minutes, filled with the sounds of her breaking down as she realized that her life of luxury was coming to a permanent end. I watched the sunset from my window while holding the letter, remembering how they had watched Tessa be thrown out of the resort with that same cold indifference. The memory of my daughter's confused face provided all the strength I needed to maintain my resolve against their manipulative pleas for forgiveness. I stood up and walked over to the office shredder, feeding the 3 pages of lies into the machine until they were reduced to thin strips of white paper. I then picked up the phone to permanently delete the voicemail recording without ever considering a response to her desperate cries for help. My decision to refuse any form of compromise was not born out of a desire for revenge, but from a fundamental need to protect the legacy of my late husband. I knew that allowing them to escape justice would only teach them that they could continue to exploit me and my child whenever they felt entitled to our assets. The legal system was now in full control of their fate, and I was perfectly content to let the judges and prosecutors determine the appropriate punishment for their greed. I felt a profound sense of peace as I realized that the cycle of manipulation had finally been broken by my refusal to be their victim any longer. Pierce called me later that evening to confirm that the federal government was moving forward with a formal indictment against both Zelda and my parents. He assured me that the evidence of wire fraud and identity theft was so extensive that a plea deal would likely be their only option to avoid the maximum penalty. I thanked him for his hard work and reiterated my stance that I would not be participating in any private negotiations or settlement offers from their side. The time for family loyalty had ended the moment they decided to steal from a fatherless child to fund a wedding for a woman who despised us. As the night settled over my house, I looked at Tessa sleeping peacefully and knew that I had made the right choice by standing my ground against their pressure. The road to justice had been long and exhausting, but the finish line was finally within my sight after months of legal battles and emotional turmoil. I was no longer the quiet widow who could be bullied into submission by the loud demands of her parents or the sharp insults of her older sister. I was a mother who had successfully defended her child's future, and that knowledge was worth more than any amount of money they had stolen from us. 6 months after the final court hearing, the official sentence for the systematic financial fraud was finally announced by the presiding judge. Dad and Mom were sentenced to actual prison time for their calculated abuse of trust and the illegal misappropriation of insurance assets. Their family home was seized by the bank to be sold at auction so that the stolen funds could be fully restored to the trust fund of Tessa. Zelda found herself completely broke while facing a suspended sentence and a court order to perform grueling manual labor to pay off the massive credit card debts left behind by Justin. I sat in the quiet living room of my new house in Maine staring at my phone screen while reflecting on that decisive 6-word text message from months ago. I realized in that peaceful moment that those few words had officially severed the cycle of manipulation that had defined my life for far too long. I looked out the window to see Tessa playing happily on the green grass, knowing that my perceived cruelty was actually a necessary act of protection. Every difficult decision I made was rooted in a mother's instinct to secure the peace and future of her child against those who wished to destroy it. Our new life began in a state of quiet safety, completely free from the presence of people who use the name of family to mask their own toxic greed. Production statement. This story is a production of our channel created specifically for educational purposes to illustrate the importance of personal boundaries. We aim to convey a powerful message about handling family crises with rational thinking and the firm application of the law to protect those who are most vulnerable. Action evaluation. Reagan demonstrated remarkable strength by making the difficult choice to cut off her toxic relatives entirely to secure the future of her daughter. This decisive action highlights that personal safety must always take priority over unhealthy loyalty. The antagonists faced the inevitable consequences of their own choices as the legal system held them accountable for their greed. Core lessons. Personal boundaries are not a sign of malice, but a necessary requirement for self-respect and the protection of your loved ones from exploitation. You must be willing to defend those boundaries even when the pressure to conform comes from your own biological relatives. Blood relations do not grant anyone a license to mistreat or steal from you under the guise of family loyalty. True family is defined by actions of support and honesty rather than biological connection or the entitlement to your hard-earned assets. Financial independence and a clear understanding of your legal rights serve as the ultimate shield against manipulation. By taking control of your resources and seeking professional legal counsel, you can dismantle the influence of toxic people and reclaim your destiny. Appreciation and call to action. We would like to send a sincere thank you to all the viewers who patiently listened to this story until the very end. Your time and attention are deeply appreciated as we share these important life lessons. How would you have handled the situation if you were in the position of Reagan? Please share your sharpest thoughts in the comments and join our growing community today.